So tonight we have presenting for us Dr. Artel Great. He is an Independent Spirit Award nominated filmmaker, Black cinema scholar, and historian of race and popular culture. He is the George and Judy Marcus Endowed Chair in African American Cinema Studies and Assistant Professor of Critical Studies at the San Francisco State University School of Cinema. He's the author of the landmark essay, Black Cinema Matters, in the New Republic and co-editor of the forthcoming book, Black Cinema and Visual Culture, Art and Politics in the 21st Century. Professor Great is currently at work on a new manuscript exploring race, resistance, and Black political humor. His directorial debut feature, Love Like Winter, is an official selection at several national film festivals. This film marks part one of his planned love cycle, a tetralogy of films chronicling Black love in America. So without further ado, I wanted to introduce Dr. Great.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome. First, I want to take this opportunity to say this is America. And I want to thank Sam and Anthony for, and the New Canaan Library for extending this invitation to me today to spend this time here with you. I'm thrilled to be here, albeit virtually. And I wanted to start us off by situating us in this current moment. That's why I started with the video, This is America. Before I begin, I just want to say that I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to address the full weight of the moment in which we live and align myself in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in the movement for Black lives, as well as the movement against anti-Asian violence in the contemporary era in what one might describe as late America. Now, I say late America in light of where we find ourselves as a nation. And I can't begin my talk today talking about movies without acknowledging that on Tuesday of this week, Black people across the nation collectively held our breath, awaiting in anticipation for this major legal verdict. And as we still process as a country the jury's decision, I will say that I am in fact grateful in the sense that it is clear, and it has always been clear for Black people, that this verdict was the only just outcome. And that is what this verdict is. It is just. However, I would argue that this verdict is not justice. This verdict is accountability. Because if there was a such thing as true justice for Black people in America, we would not know the name George Floyd, because he would still be here walking with us. If there was a such thing as true justice for Black people in America, 16-year-old Ma'Khia Bryant would still be here walking with us. If there was a such thing as justice truly for Black people in this country, Andrew Brown in North Carolina would still be here walking among us instead of being gunned down in yet another example of an extrajudicial state-sanctioned killing of an unarmed or innocent, unnecessarily murdered Black citizen. And so a lot of people have misinterpreted the moment. They see people and they think that what they see is excitement or celebration. But let me assure you that what you see in the streets from Black people is, in fact, not jubilation. What you see, in fact, is relief, because Black folk are tired of people not being held accountable after suffering a loss of life at the hands of the police. Whether it be Dante White, Wright, or Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor or Atiana Jefferson, Sandra Bland, Elijah McClain, or Rayshard Brooks. It's just too many names. And the persistence of state-sanctioned violence against Black bodies represents an undeniable catastrophe of American shame. And it speaks to the irrefutable fact that systemic racism so permeates the fabric of American life that it has been normalized to such a degree as it appears to be a part of some naturalized order. But as sure as I am here with you today, rest assured that it is not. And what we see across the nation is a deep sense of dissatisfaction with the American system of reality. Because the overall climate of violence, it seems, has come to define American life. Whether it's mass shootings or police violence or anti-Asian violence or Latinx violence, it has become abundantly clear that violence has become the daily bread of American life. And the acts of racialized violence committed against Black bodies or any American citizen, considering the reality of the shared traumas experienced currently by the Black, Brown, and Asian American communities. What we all share in common is being the subject of and not the author of seemingly never-ending tragedies of white racialized violence, which seems to be lusted after in some twisted manner in the American social imagination. Now, I hope that we never have to come to know the name of another Black martyr who has died unjustly at the hands of the police. I hope we never have to do it again. But I know that that is not our reality, because it's happening every day. And what you see is Black people simply saying, stop killing us. Now, I would submit to you that many Americans still find ourselves struggling to make sense of this country's appalling racial violence and place it in some sort of historical context. Largely unrecognized is how Black American cinema for over 100 years has forecast, critiqued, and depicted some of the very same social issues that we see effectively occurring every day on our streets. And so before I begin today, I want to take a moment to lay out the terms of engagement for us here this evening. So it's important for me to state before we begin that I identify as Black with a capital B. I say this is an important distinction to make because what it does is it situates me here with you today, not as a single individual, but rather as a part of a long continuum, a long and rich tradition of Black cultural and Black radical intellectual tradition that is composed of countless Black thinkers and luminaries, with the understanding that when using a capital B, when referring to Black people, it means that we are utilizing this term in a descriptive manner. It is a word that is descriptive, but it is also a political term and a cultural term that identifies people of African descent on a world level. Now, for the purposes of our talk here today, I'll be speaking about the American context, particularly the Black American context, which exists as a new breed hybrid formation in the West. And you will hear me tonight use terms like Black and white or Blackness and whiteness. As I employ these terms, understand that what I am not referring to is the idea of race. Now, at first glance, this might seem confusing to some people because most people understand those terms as some type of having some type of biological foundation. Yet there is no anatomical substantiation for the notion of race as it is commonly understood. So when I speak about Black and white tonight, what I'm talking about is power. Who has power and who doesn't? Richard Dyer gives us insights into this when he refers to the invention of whiteness. And James Baldwin also describes a similar notion in the American context when he describes the people who need to see themselves as white. So when I speak about Black and whiteness in this context, what I am referring to is power dynamics, where whiteness exists as the locus of power and Blackness exists on the margins of that power. And so to quote the great Toni Morrison, the kind of work that I do requires me to learn how to maneuver ways that free up the language from its sometimes sinister, frequently lazy, and always predictable employment of racially informed and determined chains. Now that we have the terms of our engagement set forth, let us imagine for a moment that everyone under the sound of my voice is under the same awareness. And so I come to you today, right now, bearing witness. And I bear witness to a question that begs to be asked. Why movies? Why now? Why do they move us? Why do they matter? Well, the answer is actually rather simple. Movies make magic. At its best, movies transform us, traveling along the borders of our minds and altering what exists. Now, I would argue that film couldn't do this by simply reflecting normalities. Instead, I would argue that motion pictures at its core is about the expanding of human possibility. And to that extent, cinema holds a very powerful function in the process of American socialization, one that cannot and should not easily be overlooked, both in US history, generally speaking, and also in American film history specifically. Each revolve around these ideas of our widespread acceptance of certain dominant ideas about who we are collectively as Americans. And furthermore, blindly accepting those ideas and those conceptions and those versions of history and the stories that are told and retold over again to help solidify our understanding of how America wants to define itself. Now, my work in cinema is preoccupied with the Black presence in film, preoccupied with a question, and ultimately with redefining the terms of our engagement and the questions that are central to the heart of American film. So instead of accepting traditional histories and traditional interpretations of American film and its histories and its persistent myths and ideologies that tend to generate the architecture of our understanding about who can and cannot participate in the sweet fruit of the American dream. But I would argue for you today that that dream for Black folks has not been a dream at all, but rather the American nightmare from which we are still struggling to awaken. With this in mind, I would submit to you this evening that a manner in which one might think about or consider the American film history and its history, its industry, its movies, its products, I would argue that an interesting way to think about American film is as a repository for this nation's neurotic obsession with race. Since the very beginning of Hollywood film, the Black image has persistently been devalued and relegated to the margins. For this reason alone, the weight of American film bears a greater weight that is far more than the weight of mere entertainment. In order for American film to actually entertain us, I submit to you that it must first be understood as a language, a visual language that is made up of signs and symbols, of codes and genres, conventions. And the question begs to be asked, what has that language historically had to say about what it means to be Black in America? You may or may not be aware of the catalog of oppressive images of Black life on screen that have been generated over and over again in Hollywood in the form of racist tropes and grotesque caricatures, or the overall rendering of Blackness as invisible. Now, contrary to some awareness, Black filmmakers have been involved in the creation of cinema for over 125 years. Black filmmakers have used cinema as a vehicle, not only for creative expression, but also as a vehicle for cultural affirmation and the reimagining of what freedom really means, and a reimagining of Black possibility. However, one of the rubs is that while working within the dominant framework, Black filmmakers are confronted with certain limitations. These limitations are both psychic and material, in that Black directors and Black filmmakers have to determine at a certain point if the work that they create will in fact resist the industry's racist history, or if it will uphold and maintain the status quo. Now, the aim of my talk today is to offer you a brief historical poetics. I can't do justice to the entirety of Black film in an hour or less. But what I'm going to do here today is tackle a few interesting moments, a few key movements or moments of rupture that I think are important to think about given the context of our current reality. The first key movement that I'd like to discuss is actually one of my favorites. It is one of my favorites because it's so rich in terms of its history and in terms of the illustrious figures who make up its story. The period that I'm referring to, some scholars have deemed this period the so-called race film era, or they call these films race films. I say so-called race films because I'm pretty sure that a Black person didn't come up with that term, race films. Can you just imagine for a moment, if you will, right? Some brothers and sisters sitting around in the 1900s. I mean, what we gonna call these films when we make it, bro? Oh no, man. Hey, look, dog, let's call these race films, bro. I'm pretty sure that didn't happen. So I like to refer to these films as Black silent era films, or just early Black films. Now, these films date as far back as the year 1896. So we're talking about the very beginning of cinema, where Black entrepreneurs and civic leaders began to promote the idea of motion pictures as a vehicle, as a tool that would actually uplift their community. Now, this amazing period saw flowering of entrepreneurial efforts across the spectrum, and Black people really began to build the American film industry. Now, this is not surprising, although it may be new. It shouldn't be surprising given the reality that Black people helped build America itself, despite the unimaginable challenges they undoubtedly faced. These early Black film pioneers began producing images and producing films long before there was ever even an idea called Hollywood. And these filmmakers possessed the power to forge a modern image of Black culture. These Black silent era films began in the 1900s, into the 1920s and 30s were their peak. And they consisted of films that posited Black themes with Black directors and Black audiences and Black casts. And they were shown in over more than 200 Black-owned movie houses that had been opened across the United States by the year 1914. Now, what's interesting about this is how prescient a lot of the early filmmakers were. Here is an article from the Chicago Defender from October 9th, 1915, okay, 1915. And the title of this article is "Moving Pictures Offer the Greatest Opportunity for the American Negro in the History of the Race from Every Point of View." Okay? So what this article does is it actually insists that Black people use cinema to portray the finer aspects and the finer qualities of Black life in an effort to set the race right with the world. William Foster, pictured here, was an early adopter of this idea, and he founded the first successful Black film studio in Chicago, years before the establishment of the first Hollywood studio. He produced several films. His best known film was a comedy called The Railroad Porter, which was released in 1912. Another important early Black film studio was founded in 1916, the Lincoln Motion Picture Company. And this firm was actually founded by a popular Black actor of the era, Noble Johnson, and a group of his partners. Noble Johnson is pictured here in the center, the tall, dark, and handsome Black brother. And he was actually under contract with Universal Pictures. And he assembled a group of partners, and they began to form Lincoln Motion Picture Company. Their first film was actually called The Realization of a Negro's Ambition. Woo! Okay, just show you where they was coming from. Okay, coming in hot, 1916. And this is actually an advertisement from a popular Black newspaper. The film, The Realization of a Negro's Ambition, actually emphasized upward mobility. It was like a Horatio Alger tale that emphasized Black people succeeding in a largely white dominated system. It's important for me to state the important role of Black women in the development of early filmmaking. Black women were deeply involved in the early filmmaking process as producers, as directors, as writers, and as actors. Black women's film were, as filmmakers, they were consistently inventive and imaginative, despite the many obstacles and restrictions that they faced. As early as the late 1890s, Black women like S.A. Bunn and Edna Walker were among the first entrepreneurs who developed traveling film exhibitions. They started actually like touring churches and concert halls, showcasing Black moving images. Former actress Teresa Tressie Souders and Maria P. Williams broke new ground as the first Black women directors in 1922 and 1923, respectively. Souter's film, A Woman's Era, and Williams's film, Flames of Wrath, were groundbreaking during the time. Now, the most prominent figure of early Black filmmaking is the novelist, businessman, Oscar Micheaux, who launched the Micheaux Film and Book Company in 1919. Okay, 1919. You got to understand, the first Hollywood studio was founded in 1915. Okay, so we're talking about years before, in terms of not Micheaux, but the filmmakers Foster, the Lincoln Motion Picture Company that I just previously described. Now, Oscar Micheaux quickly became America's first legendary Black director. He made over 50 films in 30 years. His first feature was called The Homesteader, which is, you can see a newspaper advertisement here. This film was based on his semi-autobiographical novel. However, the oldest surviving Black film, well, the oldest surviving film by a Black director, is Oscar Micheaux's second film, Within Our Gates. Now, this film was controversial at the time because it was seen as a rebuttal to the grotesque distortions of D.W. Griffith's film. The film Within Our Gates by Oscar Micheaux is actually quite important because what it does is it reveals for the first time on screen America's racial terrorism and the horrific practice of American lynching. Now, these filmmakers that I just described were able to achieve something. They were able to achieve an alternative film industry and distribution model outside of the dominant apparatus. They didn't have no social media. They ain't had no Kickstarter, no GoFundMes, no cell phones, no internet, no ads, no PR, none of that. Just passion and vision and a tremendous will to serve an audience who were thirsty to see themselves on screen. Now, this is deep because today the relationship between Black America and the dominant cinema continues to be fraught with tangled and complicated histories, both in the classical Hollywood sense and in the post-classical Hollywood sense. The Black image in terms of the 1950s and 60s, after the race film era, is really bound up in the persona of Sidney Poitier. Now, Sidney Poitier in the 60s really became a symbol in many Black communities. And he also became a symbol in the white social imagination. His body was used as a metaphor, as a stand-in for white engineered and white manufactured or white imagined Black experiences in America. The characters he was known for portraying early on were regarded for their safe ideological positioning. And when I say safe, I mean safe for white consumption. He often portrayed these non-threatening characters, or the magical Negro trope, if you will. And he was really rewarded for his performances, becoming the first Black actor to win an Oscar for Lilies of the Field in 1963. But in the 60s, you start to see these intellectual tensions emerging between factions about Poitier's ideological position. Because how can one play it safe at a time of such great upheaval and radical transformation in America? Perhaps Poitier's most important role comes in the adaptation of Lorraine Hansberry's classic play, Raisin in the Sun, a film which tells the story about a Black family in Chicago who is attempting to achieve the American dream only to find themselves seemingly caught up against an intractable system of structural inequality. And yet, by the end of the 1960s, the Vietnam War is raging. Anti-war protests are spreading across the country. The progress of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement saw a radical vision of Black identity emerge. And this radical vision of Black identity found a beautiful expression in the Black arts movement. However, what we found is that the progress of Black leadership and radical thinking Black leaders during the 60s were systematically murdered or unjustly imprisoned by the system. And Black progress was deliberately thwarted with several high-profile killings or political assassinations. Now, this is deep when you think about it, because, and look at it back to back. Medgar Evers in 63, JFK in 63, Malcolm X in 65, Dr. King in 68, Robert Kennedy in 68, and Fred Hampton in 69. I'm telling you, America was on fire. And it was Amiri Baraka who actually, in his seminal play, Dutchman, he was able to articulate, in some regards, a sense of this frustration that was experienced by Black citizens in the United States. The play was adapted into a film of the same title, Dutchman, And the film adaptation, just like the play, takes place in one location on a subway train in New York City. And the film tackles issues of race and class as a white woman strikes up a conversation with a Black man on this train. Now, what happens is that he becomes the victim of a certain sense of racial antagonism. And the clip that I'm going to show you now is actually his response after being essentially tortured psychologically for the entirety of the film. He delivers a quite powerful soliloquy.
Boy, that old face. Popping their fingers, don't know yet what they're doing. They say, I love Bessie Smith. Don't know yet that Bessie Smith is saying, kiss my ass. Kiss my black, unruly ass. Before love, suffering, desire, or anything you can explain, she's saying, and very plainly, kiss my black ass. If you don't understand that, it's you that's doing the kissing. Charlie Parker. Charlie Parker, all the hip white boys scream for Bird, and Bird singing, up your ass, ego-minded old fay. Up your ass! They sit there talking about the tortured genius of Charlie Parker. Shit. Bird would have played not a note of music. He just walked up East 67th Street and killed the first 10 white people he saw. Not a note! And I'm the great would-be poet. Yeah.
Now, what's interesting about this is, again, Amiri Baraka, this is the poet who is writing these words and putting them in the mouth of this character as a way of articulating the undeniable frustration of what can only be described in some instances as the 1960s as one long funeral. Now, as we move into as we end the 1960s and move into the 70s, it's interesting because the character of Gordon Parks becomes important. I like to think about Gordon Parks as the Jackie Robinson of American film. And I say that because with respect to both Jackie Robinson and Gordon Parks, because Gordon Parks in 1969 becomes the first Black director to direct a major Hollywood studio film. When he directed his film, The Learning Tree, which was based on a semi-autobiographical best-selling novel that he wrote. Now, Melvin Van Peebles, on the other hand, one of the most interesting figures in American cinema, his second feature film, Watermelon Man, made him actually the third Black director. The second was Ossie Davis, Cotton Comes to Harlem in 1970. But Watermelon Man is an interesting film because it is the story of a white salesman who suddenly turns Black overnight. And this film is interesting because it actually contains the first ever appearance of whiteface on film. But it is Van Peebles' third film, Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song, that really changes the industrial landscape. The film centers around the all too familiar scenario of a Black man being radicalized after witnessing white cops brutalizing another unarmed Black man. There it is. Now, the success of this film, ironically, prompts Hollywood studios to shift their production strategy and rush out a full slate of Black-themed action films, what we now understand to be the so-called Blaxploitation cycle, right? Now, the Blaxploitation cycle is an interesting period because what it does is it actually lends itself to this overflow of visual articulation and output. One interesting film from the Blaxploitation era that I think is actually one of the best is The Spook Who Sat by the Door. This is perhaps the best representative example of the fulfillment of a Black radical potential in filmmaking in the 1970s, what that might have looked like if it were allowed to prosper and develop and not be intentionally underdeveloped by the dominant apparatus. The Spook Who Sat by the Door is actually based on an adaptation of the book of the same title by Sam Greenlee. It's directed by Ivan Dixon, who was the actor who portrayed Nothing But a Man, and he also portrayed a character in Raisin in the Sun. The film, The Spook Who Sat by the Door, follows the character Dan Freeman, who is the first ever Black CIA agent. And the film centers around his attempt to radicalize Black communities in Chicago. So he uses his training as a CIA operative, and he goes back home and he tries to galvanize the street gangs and empower them and turn them into a revolutionary movement. The clip that I'm going to show you now is actually from that film, and it gives you a sense of the buoyancy and the poignancy that the film brings to bear.
Get your education, boy, she used to say. Because that's the only thing the white man can take away from you. And she was right.
No, I can't figure you, man.
What's the figure?
I mean, what are you in this for? You want power, you want revenge, you know? What is it?
It's simple, Willie. I just want to be free. How about you?
So do I.
And I hate white folks. Hate white folks. This is not about hate white folks. It's about love and freedom enough to die or kill for it if necessary. Now you're gonna need more than hate to sustain you when this thing begins. Now if you feel that way, you're no good to us and you're no good to yourself.
Now, what's important about this film is that what it does is it attempts to, in many ways, challenge the oppressive hierarchies of power. But I must also point out, importantly, that the 70s in American film and Black American cinema is not bound up entirely in the Blaxploitation genre. There are a wide array of films that were created in the 70s that were really exciting. The disco comedy Car Wash, the coming of age film Cooley High, both films directed by Michael Schultz. And what they do is they actually offer audiences a more nuanced and humanized portrayal of Black alterity. Then there's also the Motown films, right, from the 70s that were vehicles for Diana Ross and Billy D. Williams. You had Mahogany, The Wiz, and Lady Sings the Blues, which is the original Billie Holiday biopic that was nominated for 5 Oscars. Now, at the same time, the first generation of Black film students are actually being admitted into the university system, particularly at UCLA. And they were really inspired by the global art film movement, and they spearheaded their own independent movement, a movement that we now understand to be the LA Rebellion. Now, the LA Rebellion filmmakers like Julie Dash, Haile Garima, Billy Woodbury, Barbara McCullough, Zainabu Irene Davis, and Charles Burnett all created daringly profound yet tragically underseen treasures of Black cinema. Thankfully now, these works are actually receiving some long overdue recognition from the Library of Congress. My favorite of these films, I must say, just to give you a little insight, is Billy Woodbury's Bless Their Little Hearts. It's a transcendent film. If you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. Now, obviously, the mainstream impulse in American cinema in the 1980s is a dominant impulse of the high concept film, right? Thinking about Back to the Future, blockbusters, E.T., right? E.T. was the biggest film, you know, of the 80s. But at the same time, there's this interesting development. And this development is the ushering in of the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration ushered in this new wave of conservatism that attempts to, you guessed it, make America great again. A campaign slogan that was obviously pilfered from the Reagan administration in the 45th presidential campaign. And what the Reagan administration does in the 80s is creates this massive federal debt while cutting off social programs that benefit the poor and the working class and castigating the underprivileged at the same damn time. Meanwhile, what you have going on in New York City is this movement and this emergence and this bubbling forth of hip hop, a new cultural phenomenon. Hip hop itself is born out of these Black expressive elements: beatboxing, breakdancing, graffiti art, MCing, rhyming, DJing. These elements in the 1980s start to catch the attention of the dominant film industry. So by 1982, we get the first hip hop film, Wild Style. This is then followed up in 84 with Breakin', which I loved. This film was actually the first film that introduces breakdancing as a cultural phenomenon, the pop in and the lock in and everything like that. And Crush Groove, which was also directed by Michael Schultz, actually tells the origin story of the now iconic hip hop music label, Def Jam. And the interesting fact about Crush Groove is it features the first screen performance of Blair Underwood. And Blair Underwood in this film is actually playing hip hop mogul Russell Simmons. Now, one film in the 1980s that I think receives, in my opinion, far too little critical attention is a film directed by Robert Townsend. And this film is called The Spook Who Sat by the Door. I'm sorry, this film is called Hollywood Shuffle. Now, Hollywood Shuffle is one of those films that is a satirical masterpiece that challenges the disturbingly limiting practice of hiring Black actors for predominantly regressive roles. The final clip that I'm going to show you this evening is from the film Hollywood Shuffle. And in this scene, there are two actors awaiting an audition. And one actor informs the other of the consequences of their actions.
Jive, turkey.
This is bullshit.
Jesse Wilson. You're next.
That's me. Good luck, brother.
Now, what's interesting is this film is satirical in that sense, but the film remains also eerily prophetic in that that film was made in 1987, okay? 30 years later, in the year 2013, the top 2 Black movies of the year. Anybody want to take a guess what they were? Anyone? Anyone? 12 Years a Slave and The Butler. I'm saying you can't make this up, okay? You can't make it up at all. But as we move into the era of the 1990s, you see this kind of ephemeral fascination with multiculturalism that happens in the Clinton administration. And what we get in the 1990s then is this super abundance of Black films that result in the increased visibility of Black cinema, an important moment of rupture, I would add. And this moment introduces us to directors like John Singleton, Spike Lee, Kazi Lemons, Reggie Hudlin, the Hughes brothers. I mean, there's such a brilliant diversity in the 1990s. You got the Black Western, Posse, the Inkwell, Love Jones, gotta love Love Jones, Waiting to Exhale. And of course, the posthumous vehicle for Robin Harris, the Black animated film, Bebe's Kids. Now, the 1990s Black movement in cinema is only paralleled by, and in fact exceeds the output of the Blaxploitation cycle in the 1970s. And so where does that leave us? It leaves us here squarely in the 21st century, now, the second decade. And some people consider this to be a breakout moment, despite the newly instigated culture wars and the backlash of another conservative political environment where America is attempting to be made great again, whatever that means. Ironically, and perhaps predictably, this has resulted in another energetic burst of Black cinema, giving us filmmakers like Ava DuVernay and Ryan Coogler. But the modern era of Black cinema continues to challenge us with complex films like Blind Spotting, starring Daveed Diggs, or Moonlight, directed by Barry Jenkins, or the popular film Get Out, which looks at scientific racism and the attempt at challenging the notion of a post-racial society. And interestingly, both Moonlight and Get Out both won Oscars. Speaking of the Oscars, I think it's important because the event is about to occur this Sunday. Now, every year when the Oscars come around, inevitably I'm asked about issues of race at the Academy Awards, Hollywood's most prestigious event. Now, like many institutions in the wake of the public murder of George Floyd, the Oscars now in 2021 is attempting to take its stab at what I call the corporate incentives of performative wokeness. Now, when considering this year's Black nominations, I know I perhaps have a dissenting opinion. But when considering Black progress at the Oscars, I would say that the circus is perhaps a poetic metaphor. I'm reminded by the words of my pedagogical sensei, the venerable Ed Guerrero, when he says, in terms of Black progress in Hollywood, Hollywood will let Black people join its circus, but trust and believe it will only be as the clown. In other words, the Academy is presenting the appearance of progress while still maintaining a long and storied tradition of what Ishmael Reed might describe as pathology merchants. I would argue that this year's selection of Black films overwhelmingly each recycle varying narratives that fetishize Black pain and trauma. Case in point, The Rat and the Prophet, AKA Judas and the Black Messiah. Now, they want us to get all excited about this film, right? But this film is ultimately a socially ambivalent, semi-historical drama that attempts to humanize the systemic US efforts to kill Black leaders and derail the Black freedom movement. So I would argue today in the final analysis that racial misrepresentation today in the industry is not restricted to the creation of out-of-touch white executives, but also racial misrepresentation can also be the work or the result of the work of ambitious Black filmmakers themselves squirming for an opportunity at Hollywood's ultimate prize. And what this reveals is that Black cinema now has become converted into a commodity, largely in the interests of white institutions and white-owned corporations. And so Black people today are allowed to excel in the industry under one condition: that they conform to white sanctioned images of Black life. And so today, as I conclude, I argue that it is now time for Black cinema to be recognized as an important part of the American story. And it must be firmly understood as grounded in a rich legacy that is essential to the history of American film and to the mainstream cultural conversation. Black cinema can no longer and should no longer be treated as separate and unequal. Now is the time for widespread recognition of the legacy of Black film. Then and only then will we be able to address and remove the oppressive knee of systemic racism. Then and only then will we be able to right the wrongs that must be resolved. And then and only then will we be able to activate a brighter future that we as Americans only can build. And I look forward to that when we speed up that day when true justice rolled down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was not only insightful, but it was really powerful. I learned quite a bit and I really enjoyed it. If any of our participants have any questions, we can get to some of them. I have a quick question for you. I don't actually know cinema very well. I don't actually watch a lot of film, but as a librarian, one of the things we've really had to address is that our youth are always looking for literature, especially BIPOC youth, where it's not about slavery, it's not about oppression, it's not about inner city and or gun violence or missing parents or a penitentiary system. And so it's been really amazing for me that we have this groundswell of authors who are sort of taking back agency by creating these alternate historical fictions or superheroes. Can you talk to us a little bit about the Black Panther moment with Coogler and how that sort of shifts a little bit culturally, what our youth can see in cinema that's aspirational?
Absolutely, that's a great question. You know, this is interesting because I'm actually writing about Marvel's Black Panther. I make it a point to always say Marvel's Black Panther, is to avoid cultural historical amnesia, so that 20 years from now, right, when you say Black Panther, people gonna be thinking about a fictional superhero film and not the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Right. So it's always important, you know, how we employ the language. So I talk about Marvel's Black Panther. Now, the interesting thing about Marvel's Black Panther is that it was not created by Black people, right? So that it is bound up in this complicated history where, on the one hand, I argue that Marvel's Black Panther is like a Black version of Star Wars, right? It's the father, it's the son, it's in the future, it's in the Afro future, but it is rooted on this planet as opposed to intergalactically. But the question of whether or not this film is safe for the consumption of those youth that you speak of, on a surface level, yes. But when you start to peel back those layers of that onion, that film is rooted in a lot of problematics, particularly its emphasis and reliance on this white savior trope, who again, in this film, is a part of the CIA. So which becomes even more complicated when considering the history of the CIA in Africa and the history of the CIA in America. But you got this white CIA agent who at the end of the film basically has to save the day. So listen, does the film have its high points and moments of positive? Yes. But is this film a revolutionary breaking point? Only in an industrial sense, not in a sense of its context or content. I would argue that the film is a breakthrough in that it provides for the first time Black people with an opportunity to see themselves in such a major production.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Melissa. She asks, can you comment on how the film, The Last Black Man in San Francisco, fits into white corporate interests? Does it?
Hey, Melissa, thank you for that great question. The answer to that, quite simply, is yes. You know, the thing about Last Black Man in San Francisco is that, and this is the thing, a lot of people get caught up in this. Well, what is a Black film? Is it a genre? Is it Black people on screen? Is it a style? What is it? Does it mean it has to be directed by Black people? Because The Last Black Man in San Francisco is not directed by a Black person. But does that preclude it from being a Black film? Not necessarily, right? I'm thinking about films like Nothing But a Man. I'm thinking about The Color Purple, right? Both Black films that were not directed by Black directors. But the thing about The Last Black Man in San Francisco is that the film is caught up in the stylization, but it lacks social depth. And the social depth that is absent from that film, I think, is the film's major limitation. So what you have is a white director who, in some instances, and I'm not saying this director in particular, I'm saying that sometimes white directors will venture into Black content or Black subject matter as a means of anthropological exploration, which is dangerous, right? Because if you look at the film Blind Spotting, right, which is also set in San Francisco, but it is totally a different edge, dealing with similar issues. So I think that The Last Black Man in San Francisco is in some ways empty of social depth.
Thank you. Our next question is from Michaela, a good friend of mine. She wants you to repeat the name of Oscar Michaud's second film, the one that rebuts D.W. Griffiths. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yes. The film is called Within Our Gates. You could actually watch it on YouTube. I'm not sure how many versions are on there, but there are a few of Oscar Michaud's films on YouTube. Body and Soul, which is the directorial debut of the screen debut of Paul Robeson. There's a great copy of the Criterion copy is on YouTube. But the film is called Within Our Gates, and it deals with Black migration from the South to the North, but it also, for the first time, captures as a rebuttal to the birth of a nation. It depicts in a very real way, and for the first time ever, the process or the practice of American terrorism and the practice of lynching that was quite widespread in the United States during that period. And this film castigates that. And it was quite controversial. And it was actually censored and banned and recut many times to surgically remove that tension.
Thank you, Dr. Great. We have a question from Vivian. She wants to know what's the best way to see some of the earliest films that you showed us tonight.
Wow. Come hang out with me. I can put you on. Listen, they exist. Perhaps we can put together a list in conjunction with the library that we could submit to your constituents that could help identify. Some of these films are hard to find. Some of them, with a little leg work and elbow grease, you can get them. But many of these films, it's hard for me to find some of the films, right?
That would be great. And we can share in a follow-up email, we can include a few references and links.
Oh, I'd be happy to do it.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. Melissa asks, do you think Beasts of the Southern Wild also lacks social depth for reasons similar to The Last Black Man in San Francisco?
You know, Melissa, that's a great question too. And this is deep because I'm not just a film scholar, I'm a filmmaker, right? So it's not like I'm just, you know, some person sitting on the sidelines just trying to, I know the people, I know some of these people personally, and I know the people behind Beasts of the Southern Wild. I think they're good guys. I think that the film is problematic in a certain manner. I think that the spirit of the film, and this is the thing, I'm not questioning the quality of the work or the people behind the work, but my argument is with the apparatus, the dominant cinema apparatus that is inherently biased, where what happens is certain voices are precluded and certain voices are allowed to participate in the cultural conversation. Now, my position is that Black creative image makers are far too often, in my opinion, rendered silent. And so when you have situations where there are a plethora of dynamic Black filmmakers who can make those stories, the question becomes, whose stories are deemed worthy of being told? And in the case of the Beasts of the Southern Wild, number one, who are the beasts? And why are they wild? And number two, who's determines who gets to tell that particular story? Because it matters. Black cinema matters, Black voices matter, and Black directors matter. And it's high time for us to recognize that incredible fact.
Thank you so much. You've been really generous with your time. We have a few other comments just thanking you and people taking notes and making lists of things to watch. This has been really wonderful. I think you have a student here that notes that it's an honor being your student and seeing you outside of class.
Who is that?
It's Genesis.
All right, you got an A for today. No.
Well done, Genesis. You just got extra credit. And Tarshell is also here. But yes, lots of people here that are really appreciative. This is really wonderful. I really enjoyed it. It was wonderful to meet you virtually, and thank you for this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the New Canaan Library. Thank you, Anthony. And hope to do it again in person.
That would be wonderful. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and good night.